Can you imagine dedicating your entire existence to nurturing someone, only to have them systematically destroy your life for profit? The kind of betrayal that doesn't just wound your heart, but creates a hollow ache that seems to consume your very soul. My name is Carol, and for 32 years, I wove my life around my daughter, Emily. As a single mother, I endured countless personal hardships, working multiple jobs and sacrificing my own dreams to give her stability and love. I shared my deepest vulnerabilities with her, believing that honesty about my past mistakes would build the foundation for a stronger, more understanding relationship between us. But Emily took those sacred confidences and weaponized them. Using her growing online platform, she publicly exposed me to millions of strangers, twisting half-truths and grotesquely exaggerating my past struggles. She broadcast my most private secrets, like entertainment, turning my moments of human frailty into content for her followers to devour. My heart didn't just break, it shattered into fragments that seemed impossible to piece back together. Yet in that crushing darkness of public humiliation, something unexpected stirred within me. Emily thought she controlled the narrative completely, but she'd overlooked something crucial: my carefully kept collection of letters, photographs, and a private journal that told our real story, not the fiction she'd created for clicks and fame. The internet became my personal hell overnight. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. I was afraid to check each vibration, feeling like another knife twist in my chest. My email inbox overflowed with messages from strangers who knew nothing about me except what Emily had chosen to share, their words dripping with hatred and judgment that cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Stepping outside my small apartment felt like walking into a courtroom where I'd already been convicted without trial. The grocery store clerk who'd smiled at me for 15 years now avoided eye contact. My mailman Tom, who used to chat about his grandchildren, hurried past my door without his usual friendly wave. Even the teenagers in my neighborhood seemed to whisper and point when they thought I wasn't looking, their phones always ready to capture another moment of my public shame. The community that had been my quiet refuge for decades suddenly felt hostile and dangerous. Every face seemed to carry judgment. Every conversation felt like it stopped when I approached. I found myself planning my errands for the earliest morning hours, hoping to avoid the crowds that might recognize me from Emily's viral posts. The simple act of buying milk and bread became an exercise in survival, my heart pounding with anxiety every time someone looked in my direction. My small apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, filled with memories of raising Emily, transformed into a prison where I could hide from the world's condemnation. I started keeping the curtains drawn, afraid that someone might see me through the windows and decide to document my misery for their own social media posts. The walls that had once echoed with Emily's childhood laughter now seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with the weight of isolation and shame. Emily, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of her newfound internet fame. Her follower count had exploded overnight, bringing with it sponsorship deals and interview requests that turned her betrayal into a profitable career move. She maintained a public facade of wounded victimhood that was masterfully crafted, offering carefully scripted statements about healing and breaking free from toxic family cycles that her audience ate up with enthusiastic support. What made her cruelty even more calculated was how she actively cultivated the mob that had formed around her story. She would subtly encourage her followers to call out anyone who dared question her narrative, turning her audience into digital soldiers who would attack on her behalf. When I tried to reach out through mutual friends or distant relatives, Emily's followers would somehow discover these connections and launch coordinated harassment campaigns against anyone who showed me even the slightest sympathy. She'd created a perfect system of control where I couldn't defend myself without facing an even larger backlash. Any attempt to tell my side of the story was immediately branded as gaslighting or typical abuser behavior by her army of devoted fans. She had effectively silenced me while positioning herself as the brave survivor sharing her truth with the world. Despite the relentless assault on my character and the mounting evidence of Emily's calculated cruelty, part of me desperately clung to denial like a life raft in stormy seas. This couldn't be my Emily, my little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd made me countless Mother's Day cards with crayon hearts and promises to love me forever. The daughter who'd shared her deepest fears with me during her teenage years, who'd cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart. I found myself making increasingly desperate excuses for her behavior, searching frantically for explanations that might preserve some shred of the relationship I'd thought we had. Perhaps she was being pressured by her online manager or influenced by other content creators who'd convinced her this was the only way to build her platform. Maybe she was having some kind of mental health crisis and didn't realize the full impact of what she was doing to me. I spent hours scrolling through her old social media posts, looking for signs of the loving daughter I remembered, trying to find evidence that this was all some terrible misunderstanding or a cry for help that had spiraled out of control. I replayed our last few conversations before this nightmare began, analyzing every word for clues about when our relationship had started to deteriorate and what I might have done to prevent this devastation. But Emily's online posts were a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as victimhood. She would share old grainy photographs of me from difficult periods in my life, adding captions with vague but ominous statements about the past that still haunts her healing journey. The photos were always chosen to make me look tired, stressed, or unflattering, never the hundreds of pictures where I was smiling proud or showing obvious love for my daughter. She became expert at creating videos that hinted at toxic environments and childhood trauma without ever providing specific details, allowing her followers to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions and projections. She'd share heavily edited snippets of our private conversations from years past, removing all context and twisting my words to fit her narrative of victimhood. A concerned question about her well-being became evidence of my controlling behavior. An attempt to set healthy boundaries became proof of my emotional abuse. Every post was carefully crafted to strip away another layer of my dignity, while positioning her as the long-suffering victim, finally brave enough to speak her truth. She knew exactly which buttons to push to keep her audience engaged and outraged, feeding them just enough details to maintain their interest, while leaving room for their imaginations to fill in even worse scenarios than what she was actually claiming. The constant barrage of public humiliation began affecting every aspect of my daily existence in ways I'd never anticipated. I stopped going to my usual grocery store after a teenage employee recognized me and started filming me shopping later, posting the video with cruel commentary about "spotted the toxic mom in aisle 5." The simple act of buying food became a source of terror and shame. My few remaining friends started distancing themselves, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. They'd seen what happened to anyone who publicly defended me or even showed me basic human kindness. Emily's followers would research their social media, their workplaces, their family members turning support for me into a liability that could destroy their own lives. The isolation was complete and devastating. I found myself increasingly unable to leave my apartment, feeling physically and mentally paralyzed by the fear of being recognized and subjected to public confrontation or humiliation. My modest savings, which had once provided security and comfort, began dwindling as the psychological toll made it impossible to maintain even the simplest routines like working or managing my affairs. The helplessness was suffocating. I was trapped within a digital prison that Emily had constructed with surgical precision, watching my life unravel in real time while millions of strangers cheered for my destruction. Every day brought fresh waves of hatred and judgment, each one feeling like a physical blow that left me more broken than the day before. Emily's online attacks evolved from subtle character assassination into outright fabrication, revealing a level of malice that took my breath away with its calculated cruelty. She released a tearful video that went viral within hours, claiming that I had deliberately sabotaged her childhood dreams by refusing to support her interests and actively discouraging her talents. This was a complete lie. I had worked double shifts to pay for her dance lessons, art supplies, and every other pursuit she'd ever shown interest in. But the truth didn't matter to her growing audience. They saw a young woman bravely sharing her painful story, and they responded with an outpouring of support that translated directly into financial gain for Emily. Sponsorship deals poured in from companies wanting to align themselves with her inspirational journey of healing. She discovered that trauma, real or manufactured, was incredibly profitable in the digital age. The harassment campaign she orchestrated became more sophisticated and coordinated. She would post cryptic messages about feeling triggered or needing extra support from her community, which her followers understood as signals to flood my remaining social media accounts with hateful comments. They found my old business page from when I'd tried freelance bookkeeping, turning it into a repository of one-star reviews and vicious personal attacks that destroyed any chance I might have had of earning income. Even worse, they began targeting anyone who'd ever shown me kindness online. A former neighbor who'd wished me well on my birthday found herself doxxed and harassed until she deleted all her social media accounts. A distant cousin who'd made the mistake of commenting with a heart emoji on one of my photos years earlier was subjected to a campaign that nearly cost her job when Emily's followers contacted her employer, claiming she was supporting an abuser. The psychological warfare was relentless and expertly executed. Emily had turned my very existence into content, and every aspect of my life became fair game for her audience's entertainment and moral outrage. She wasn't just destroying my reputation, she was systematically erasing any possibility that I could rebuild a normal life or maintain relationships with other people. The moment of shattering realization came when I was watching the local evening news and saw a segment titled, "The Psychology of Toxic Mothers in the Digital Age." The expert they'd brought on, a family therapist I'd never met, was using my thinly veiled story as a prime example of maternal narcissism and emotional abuse. She spoke about women like me with clinical detachment analyzing my supposed character flaws and psychological motivations as if I were a case study rather than a human being. Hearing this stranger dissect my personality and parenting based entirely on Emily's fabricated narrative was like watching my own autopsy performed on live television. The expert discussed my pattern of manipulation and inability to accept responsibility for harm caused to my child, presenting Emily's lies as established psychological fact. She recommended that other adult children in similar situations cut contact immediately and seek therapy to break the cycle of abuse. In that moment, watching this professional validate Emily's false narrative with such authority and confidence, I finally understood the full scope of what my daughter had done. This wasn't a misguided cry for help or a phase she was going through. This was deliberate, calculated character assassination designed to permanently destroy my life while building her own career on the ruins of my reputation. The expert's cold clinical analysis confirmed that Emily wasn't confused or pressured by others. She was actively, maliciously dismantling me for profit, and she'd become skilled enough at it to fool even trained professionals. My grief and confusion transformed into something much more frightening, a scorching rage and soul-crushing horror at the realization that the child I'd raised had become someone capable of such systematic cruelty. The painful memories that followed this revelation felt like salt being poured into open wounds. I remembered the year I'd turned down a promotion that would have required relocation, choosing instead to stay in our small town so Emily could finish high school with her friends. I'd sacrificed career advancement and financial security because I believed stability was more important than my own professional dreams. I thought about the countless times I'd worked 2 jobs just to afford things that other parents took for granted: her participation in school activities, decent clothes, the summer camp she'd begged to attend. I'd denied myself basic comforts like new clothes or occasional dinners, out eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so she could have proper meals and the normal teenage experiences I'd never had myself. Most agonizing of all were the memories of my deepest vulnerabilities that I'd shared with Emily in moments of complete trust. During her teenage years, when she'd struggled with self-esteem and made some poor choices, I'd opened up about my own difficult past, my struggles with depression, the mistakes I'd made as a young woman, the shame I still carried about periods of my life when I hadn't been the person I wanted to be. I'd shared these painful truths, believing it would help her understand that everyone struggles, that mistakes don't define us, and that growth and redemption are always possible. I'd wanted her to know that I understood her pain because I'd felt it too, that she could come to me with anything, because I would never judge her the way the world might. Now, Emily had weaponized every one of those intimate confessions, turning my moments of honesty and vulnerability into ammunition for her public destruction of my character. She'd taken my deepest regrets and presented them as evidence of my fundamental unfitness as a human being, stripping away all context and compassion to create the most damaging narrative possible. Somehow, I found the courage to send Emily one final desperate message, pleading with her to remember the love we'd shared and to consider the devastating impact her actions were having on my life. I poured my heart into that message, reminding her of the sacrifices I'd made, the support I'd given her, and the genuine care that had motivated every decision I'd made as her mother. Her response was swift and devastating. Instead of a private reply, she created a public video that I knew was meant as much for me as for her followers. Sitting in what appeared to be a therapist's office with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed in the frame, she delivered what felt like a final blow to any hope I'd held for reconciliation. I'm finally breaking free from the toxic patterns that almost destroyed me, she said, her voice perfectly modulated to convey brave vulnerability. My mother's manipulation and emotional abuse shaped my entire childhood, and I'm only now learning to recognize how deeply she damaged my ability to trust and love. This is my truth, and I'm sharing it for all the silence victims out there who need to know they're not alone. Her words were meticulously chosen to maximize both their emotional impact on her audience and their devastating effect on me. She wasn't just rejecting my plea for understanding, she was using it as evidence of my continued abuse, framing my desperate attempt to salvage our relationship as further proof of my toxic nature. The calculated nature of her response revealed the depth of her transformation from daughter to destroyer. She'd become someone who could look directly into a camera and lie with complete conviction, someone who could weaponize the language of healing and recovery to justify the systematic destruction of another human being's life. The relentless onslaught of public vitriol, combined with Emily's escalating cruelty, pushed me to a breaking point I didn't know existed. I felt physically and mentally shattered, as if my entire being had been dismantled piece by piece and scattered to the winds. The constant stress had manifested in physical symptoms, sleepless nights, panic attacks, a complete loss of appetite that left me weak and disoriented. I began seriously considering simply disappearing, changing my name, moving to another state, anything to escape the constant torment and start over where nobody knew Emily's version of my story. The idea of leaving behind every connection to my old life felt both terrifying and oddly liberating, like the only possible escape from a prison that had no visible walls but was nonetheless inescapable. Some days I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed, overwhelmed by the futility of trying to defend myself against an enemy who controlled the narrative so completely. I turned off my phone for days at a time, refusing to answer the door, existing in a state of self-imposed isolation that felt like the only way to protect what remained of my sanity. I had surrendered to the overwhelming despair, feeling utterly defeated by forces I didn't understand and couldn't fight. My spirit felt crushed beyond repair, and I couldn't see any path forward that didn't lead to more pain and humiliation. The final assault on my humanity came in the form of Emily's tell-all documentary episode, released on a popular streaming platform that gave her lies the veneer of professional credibility. She'd spent months crafting this comprehensive character assassination, using every tool of modern media manipulation to create a polished piece of propaganda disguised as brave truth-telling. The production values were impressive: professional lighting, carefully chosen music, expertly edited sequences that made her fabricated story feel emotionally authentic and visually compelling. She'd manipulated audio clips from our old phone conversations, removing context and splicing together fragments to create exchanges that had never actually happened, but sounded convincingly real to anyone who hadn't been present for the original conversations. The documentary featured distorted photographs from throughout my life, each one chosen and edited to support her narrative. Pictures of me looking tired after working double shifts became evidence of my instability. Photos where I appeared stressed during difficult financial periods were presented as proof of my erratic behavior. She even included childhood drawings she'd made that showed typical family scenes, but she narrated them as illustrations of the fear and confusion she'd felt living with me. Most devastating of all, she'd somehow convinced my estranged sister, Linda, to participate in the documentary. Linda, who'd been jealous of my relationship with Emily for years and had minimal contact with either of us, suddenly became a key witness to my supposed patterns of abuse. Her testimony was clearly coached and rehearsed, filled with vague accusations and carefully worded suggestions that avoided anything concrete enough to be legally challenged. Linda spoke about concerns she'd had over the years and incidents she'd supposedly witnessed. But when pressed for details, she would deflect with phrases like, "I don't want to re-traumatize Emily by being too specific," or Some things are too painful to discuss publicly. Her participation gave Emily's lies the third-party validation they needed to seem credible to viewers who had no way of knowing the real family dynamics. The documentary ended with Emily speaking directly to the camera about her journey of healing and her hope that sharing her story would help other victims find the courage to speak their truth. She encouraged viewers to support organizations that help abuse survivors and to believe victims when they find the courage to come forward. The irony of her positioning herself as an advocate for truth and justice while systematically lying about her own mother was lost on an audience that had been expertly manipulated into seeing her as a hero. The impact was immediate and devastating. The documentary was shared millions of times across social media platforms, bringing a new wave of harassment that dwarfed anything I'd experienced before. News outlets picked up the story featuring Emily as a brave survivor while painting me as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of maternal narcissism. My face became synonymous with toxic parenting, used in articles and discussions I had no part in and no ability to refute. I reached my absolute lowest point in the days following the documentary's release. The shame was so overwhelming, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe or move. The constant stream of hatred and judgment had worn away my ability to see any value in my own existence, and I began to seriously contemplate whether the world might be better off without me in it. The isolation was complete and suffocating. I couldn't leave my apartment without risking recognition and confrontation. I couldn't maintain relationships because anyone associated with me became a target for Emily's followers. I couldn't work because employers would immediately recognize my name and face from the viral content. I'd become a ghost existing, but not really living, trapped in a prison of public condemnation with no apparent way out. The physical toll was as severe as the emotional devastation. I'd lost significant weight because eating had become difficult, my stomach constantly churning with anxiety and stress. Sleep brought no relief because my dreams were filled with the faces of strangers screaming accusations at me, and I'd wake up feeling more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. I found myself staring at bottles of pills in my medicine cabinet, calculating whether I had enough to simply end the nightmare permanently. The thought of continuing to exist in this state of constant torment felt impossible, and the idea of peace, even the permanent kind, began to seem like the only reasonable solution to an unbearable situation. That's when the letter arrived. It was handwritten on simple stationery, addressed to me personally, rather than forwarded through the internet's digital channels of communication. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting another piece of hate mail or legal threat, but instead found words that felt like cool water on burning skin. "Dear Carol," it began, "I know you probably don't remember me, but we went to high school together. I'm Martha Wilson now, though you might remember me as Martha Collins from chemistry class. I've been watching this horrible situation unfold, and I need you to know that I remember who you really are." Martha's letter continued with memories I'd forgotten, times I'd helped her with homework, defended her from bullies, included her in activities when she was feeling left out. She wrote about how she'd watched me with Emily during school events over the years, observing the obvious love and pride I'd shown as a mother, the way Emily had clung to me during difficult times. "I don't know what's happened between you and Emily," Martha wrote, "but I know the person I've seen described in these news stories isn't the Carol Morrison I've known for decades. You are loved, you are valued, and you deserve better than what's being done to you." The letter concluded with an offer that felt like divine intervention. "I remember that shoebox of mementos you gave me for safekeeping when you moved apartments about 10 years ago. You said they were too precious to risk losing in the move. Would you like me to bring them to you? Sometimes when we're lost, we need reminders of who we really are. That shoebox, delivered by Martha the next day, contained treasures I'd forgotten I'd preserved. There were letters from my parents written during Emily's childhood, praising my devotion as a mother and expressing their pride in the young woman I'd raised. There were photographs from every stage of Emily's life, showing genuine moments of joy and connection that couldn't be faked or manipulated. Most importantly, there was my private journal pages and pages of honest reflections about my struggles and triumphs as a single mother. I documented not just my mistakes and regrets, but also my growth, my learning, my countless efforts to be better for Emily's sake. I'd written about the sacrifices I'd made gladly, the pride I'd felt in her achievements, the unconditional love that had motivated every major decision in my adult life. But the journal also contained something else detailed, accounts of times when I'd helped Emily through personal crises that she was now publicly distorting. Her eating disorder in high school, when I'd spent months researching treatment options and attending therapy sessions with her. Her struggles with anxiety in college, when I'd driven hundreds of miles at a moment's notice whenever she'd called in distress. I documented instances where Emily had confided her deepest fears and insecurities, moments when she'd expressed gratitude for my support and love. I'd recorded conversations where she'd acknowledged her own mistakes and thanked me for standing by her through difficult times. The journal painted a picture of our relationship that was complex and real, not the simplified narrative of abuse that Emily had created for public consumption. Reading through these authentic records of our shared history, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. I didn't need to fight Emily publicly or try to destroy her the way she'd destroyed me. But I needed to reclaim my own narrative, not for the world's approval, but for my own sanity and sense of self-worth. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a reluctant but steely resolve beginning to form within me. I had tools Emily didn't know about: documentation of the truth, evidence of the real relationship we'd shared, proof that the monster she'd created for public consumption bore no resemblance to the mother I'd actually been. My first step toward reclaiming some fragment of my sanity wasn't to hire a lawyer or fight fire with fire on social media. Instead, it was something far more terrifying and vulnerable, sitting across from Martha in her modest living room and telling her the complete, unvarnished truth about my life with Emily. Opening that shoebox felt like performing surgery on my own heart, each item a piece of evidence that the world had never been allowed to see. The process was agonizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sharing my deepest vulnerabilities with another person, even someone as kind as Martha, required me to tear open decades of carefully buried pain and shame. I had to recount not just Emily's betrayal, but my own genuine mistakes as a young mother, the times I'd been impatient, the decisions I'd made out of fear rather than wisdom, the moments when I'd fallen short of the mother I'd wanted to be. But I also shared the fuller picture that Emily had deliberately omitted from her viral narrative. I showed Martha the journal entries, documenting my constant efforts to improve my sleepless nights, worrying about Emily's well-being, my willingness to sacrifice anything for her happiness and success. I revealed the extent of my financial sacrifices, the career opportunities I'd passed up, the relationships I'd ended because they interfered with my dedication to being the best mother I could be. Martha listened with the kind of patient attention that had become foreign to me after months of digital harassment. She didn't interrupt or judge or offer quick solutions. She simply witnessed my pain and validated my experience, confirming that my truth resonated with someone who had no reason to lie or manipulate. Her unwavering belief in my character felt like the first genuine human connection I'd experienced since this nightmare began. "You know what strikes me most about everything you've shared," Martha said after I'd finished speaking. "You're still protecting her. Even now, after everything she's done, you're more focused on understanding why she did it than on destroying her the way she's destroyed you." Her observation hit me like a revelation. She was right. Even in my darkest moments of rage and betrayal, I'd never once considered using the weapons I had against Emily. I could have shared her childhood struggles, publicly exposed her own mistakes and vulnerabilities, turned her followers against her with carefully crafted truths about her character. But the thought had never seriously crossed my mind because despite everything, I was still her mother. Meanwhile, Emily continued basking in the glow of her online success, completely unaware that I'd found any measure of support or strength. Her platform continued growing, fed by the constant stream of outrage and sympathy her story had generated. Sponsored content flowed in, steadily transforming her betrayal of me into a lucrative career that showed no signs of slowing down. When whispers of my quiet resilience began circulating through mutual acquaintances, people who'd heard I was seeking therapy and trying to rebuild some semblance of a life, Emily's response was swift and dismissive. In a live stream with thousands of viewers, she rolled her eyes and laughed when someone mentioned that I was trying to tell my side of the story. "My mother's probably just trying to generate sympathy," she said with that practiced expression of patient suffering that had become her trademark. "Old habits die hard. You know, some people just can't accept responsibility for their actions. They'd rather play victim than face the truth about what they've done." She dismissed any suggestion that there might be complexity to our story as evidence of my pathetic efforts to cling to victimhood. The casual cruelty in her voice, the way she could speak about me as if I were a stranger rather than the woman who'd given her life, revealed the complete transformation of the daughter I'd once known into someone capable of breathtaking callousness. Through Martha's gentle encouragement and the foundation of support she provided, I began taking tentative steps toward professional help. Finding a therapist willing to work with someone whose situation was so publicly visible proved challenging, but eventually I connected with Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist who understood the unique psychological damage that comes from being systematically destroyed by someone you love. Sharing my story in Dr. Chen's office felt like a small but significant victory. For the first time in months, I could speak my truth without fear of judgment or retaliation, could explore the complex emotions surrounding Emily's betrayal without worrying about how my words might be twisted or used against me. I began finding language for pain I'd never been able to articulate, understanding patterns of manipulation I'd been too close to recognize. But this victory felt hollow and bittersweet. While therapy was helping me process the trauma and develop coping strategies, it couldn't erase the public shame or restore the relationships that had been destroyed. It was a step toward internal healing, but it also served as a painful reminder that my relationship with Emily was permanently fractured, marked by scars that would never fully fade. Dr. Chen helped me understand that Emily's behavior represented a profound form of psychological abuse, one made more devastating by our biological relationship and the public nature of her attacks. She explained how digital platforms could amplify narcissistic tendencies and reward cruelty with attention and financial gain, creating perverse incentives for people to exploit their closest relationships for content. Emily, sensing some shift in my demeanor that threatened her narrative of complete control, launched a new and more aggressive campaign against me. Her latest video was a masterpiece of manipulation, combining fake vulnerability with calculated menace as she addressed her followers about what she called ongoing harassment from me. "I need to address something that's been really troubling me," she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I've been getting reports that my mother is still trying to contact me through other people, still trying to manipulate the situation. It's honestly terrifying to know that someone who caused me so much trauma is still trying to insert themselves into my life." She urged her followers to report any suspicious activity if they encountered me in person, effectively painting me as a dangerous stalker rather than a mother seeking some measure of healing. She intensified her public slander by implying that I posed a threat to others, particularly young women who might be vulnerable to my supposed manipulation tactics. The message was clear. I was not allowed to exist in any space, physical or digital, without her permission. Any attempt to rebuild my life or seek support would be framed as evidence of my continued abuse. She was determined to maintain absolute control over the narrative, ensuring my complete social and psychological isolation. The weight of this escalating conflict settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I felt weary in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion, worn down by the constant vigilance required to simply exist in a world where my own daughter had turned millions of strangers into potential enemies. The grim determination to survive was growing stronger, but it came at the cost of any hope for reconciliation or family healing. Dr. Chen had been encouraging me to reclaim small pieces of my life outside the confines of my apartment, suggesting that avoiding all public spaces was allowing Emily's campaign to achieve its goal of complete isolation. "You have as much right to exist in this world as anyone else," she'd reminded me during our sessions. "Hiding indefinitely isn't healing, it's just another form of prison." With her words echoing in my mind, I ventured out on a quiet Tuesday afternoon to walk through Riverside Park, a place where Emily and I had spent countless joyful hours during her childhood. The familiar pathways triggered a flood of bittersweet memories that I'd been avoiding for months, but Dr. Chen had convinced me that facing these ghosts was necessary for my recovery. The playground equipment looked exactly the same as it had 15 years earlier. The blue swing set where Emily had spent hours soaring toward the clouds while I pushed her higher and higher, both of us laughing until our sides ached. The sandbox where she'd built elaborate castles, and I'd helped her populate them with stick figures and leaf boats. The climbing structure where she'd conquered her fear of heights one determined summer with me spotting her every careful step. Standing there alone, watching other families create new memories in the space where ours had been formed, I felt the full weight of what had been lost. These weren't just memories of good times. They were evidence of genuine love, proof that the relationship Emily was now describing to millions of strangers had once been real and beautiful and worth fighting for. But the peace of this nostalgic reverie was shattered when I turned the corner and saw Emily's face beaming down at me from a massive digital billboard overlooking the park's main entrance. She was advertising some kind of wellness product, her smile wide and artificially perfect, her success built on the foundation of my suffering, now impossible to escape, even in the places that had once brought me comfort. The irony was devastating and complete. Here I was, trying to heal by revisiting spaces where we'd shared genuine happiness, while her image literally loomed over me like a constant reminder that she'd turned our relationship into a profitable brand. The billboard had probably been expensive money she'd earned by destroying me, was now being used to ensure I couldn't escape her presence anywhere in this town. A group of teenagers had gathered near the billboard, scrolling through their phones and chattering excitedly. I couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation as they discussed Emily's latest posts and shared content among themselves. "Did you see her new video about setting boundaries with toxic family?" one girl was saying. "She's so brave for speaking out about her terrible mother." "I know, right? I can't imagine having to deal with someone that manipulative. She's like such an inspiration for survivors." Their words cut through me like physical blows, each casual judgment a reminder of how thoroughly Emily had poisoned public perception of me. These young people who knew nothing about me beyond what Emily had chosen to share had formed complete and damning opinions about my character based on carefully crafted lies. As I stood frozen by the combination of memories and public condemnation, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. Mrs. Johnson, a neighbor who'd lived 2 houses down from us for over a decade, was walking toward me with an expression I'd never seen on her kind face before. Where there had once been warmth and friendly concern, now there was suspicion and barely contained hostility. Mrs. Johnson had been someone I'd considered a friend, someone who'd borrowed cups of sugar and shared neighborhood gossip over coffee. Her daughter Jessica had been Emily's playmate throughout elementary school, and I'd driven both girls to countless activities and sleepovers. She'd attended Emily's high school graduation party in our backyard, celebrating alongside us as if she were family. Now she approached me like I was a dangerous stranger, her entire demeanor radiating the collective condemnation that Emily had orchestrated through her online platform. Her presence transformed the park from a place of peaceful reflection into a courtroom where I'd already been convicted without trial. "So you're still in town, Carol?" she said, her voice low, but laced with accusation. "After everything Emily shared about you, it's truly shocking, isn't it, learning what you really are? My children watch Emily's videos now. They think she's so brave for speaking out about what you put her through." Her words were delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed completely in her own righteousness, someone who'd never questioned whether there might be another side to the story she'd been fed through social media. She wasn't just expressing her own opinions, she was channeling the collective judgment of Emily's millions of followers, serving as their representative in this real-world confrontation. "You should be ashamed," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Trying to keep a good woman down, trying to silence a victim who finally found the courage to speak her truth. Some people just never change, do they? You just need to disappear and let Emily live her life in peace. The irony of being told to disappear by someone standing in a public park where I had every right to exist wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Johnson had appointed herself as judge and executioner, delivering Emily's verdict with all the authority of someone who'd never questioned the narrative they'd been fed. But something had shifted in me during my weeks of therapy with Dr. Chen. While Mrs. Johnson's words still hurt, they didn't destroy me the way they would have just months earlier. I'd begun to understand that her hostility said more about the power of digital manipulation than it did about my actual character or worth as a human being. I met her gaze directly, my eyes dry and my voice steady despite tremor of emotion I couldn't quite suppress. "My life is my own, Mrs. Johnson," I said quietly, each word carefully chosen. "And my truth is not for public consumption. Some stories are far more complex than a viral video can capture." As I spoke, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small dried flower I'd been carrying since visiting my old garden the week before. It was a pansy, one of the hardy little flowers that had survived despite neglect and harsh weather. I pressed it gently between my fingers, feeling its papery texture and remembering the joy I'd once found in simple, beautiful things. The gesture wasn't grand or defiant, just an elderly woman holding a flower in a public park. But to me, it represented something profound, the understanding that while Emily and her followers could attack my reputation and isolate me from community, they couldn't touch the essential core of who I was, or my right to find meaning and beauty in the world around me. Mrs. Johnson looked confused by my response, clearly expecting either collapse or confrontation, rather than this quiet assertion of dignity. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving me alone with my memories and my small flower feeling simultaneously heartbroken and strangely empowered. Dr. Chen had suggested that I might benefit from exploring legal options, not necessarily to launch a public counterattack against Emily, but to establish some boundaries around the most egregious lies and harassment. You don't have to suffer in silence, she'd reminded me. There are laws designed to protect people from exactly the kind of systematic defamation you've experienced. Through her professional network, she connected me with a legal aid clinic that specialized in online harassment and defamation cases. The lawyers there, led by a determined young woman named Jessica Martinez, understood the unique challenges faced by people whose lives had been destroyed by viral misinformation campaigns. Meeting with Jessica felt like stepping into a different world, one where my suffering was taken seriously and treated as a legitimate legal matter rather than entertainment for millions of strangers. She listened to my story with professional attention, taking notes and asking detailed questions about specific post videos and harassment campaigns that Emily had orchestrated. What Emily has done goes far beyond expressing her opinion or sharing her perspective. Jessica explained during our first consultation. She's engaged in a systematic campaign of defamation and harassment that has had measurable impacts on your life, your mental health, and your ability to function in society. That's not protected speech that's actionable harm. But the process of pursuing even modest legal remedies proved emotionally devastating. Each consultation required me to relive Emily's attacks in clinical detail, dissecting her cruelty with legal precision while maintaining the professional distance necessary for effective advocacy. It felt like performing an autopsy on my own destroyed relationship with my daughter, examining each wound inflicted with cold, analytical attention. Jessica helped me draft a careful cease and desist letter focused on Emily's most blatantly false claims, the instances where she described events that simply hadn't happened or attributed quotes to me that I'd never said. We weren't trying to silence her legitimate perspective on our relationship, but rather to establish that certain factual claims were demonstrably untrue and legally problematic. Emily's response to the legal intervention was swift and predictable. Within hours of receiving the cease and desist letter, she was broadcasting live to her followers about what she characterized as a new form of abuse and harassment from me. She held up the legal document like evidence of my continued toxicity, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "I can't believe she's trying to silence me," Emily said, tears streaming down her face in a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "After everything she put me through, now she wants to use lawyers to intimidate me into silence. This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior I've been trying to heal from my entire life." She portrayed the cease and desist as proof of my desperation and vindictiveness, encouraging her followers to see my attempt to establish basic legal boundaries as further evidence of my abusive character. She rallied her audience to send me threatening messages and report my remaining online presence, turning my modest effort at self-protection into ammunition for an even more vicious campaign. But Jessica had anticipated this reaction and prepared accordingly. Working with the legal aid clinic's technology specialists, she'd carefully documented Emily's pattern of encouraging harassment and had identified the specific platform violations represented by her most egregious content. Instead of engaging in a public battle, we pursued a quieter but more effective approach. Jessica submitted a formal complaint to Emily's primary social media platform, providing carefully selected excerpts from my journal and dated photographs that directly contradicted Emily's most sensationalized claims. The evidence was irrefutable documentation that Emily had been present and apparently happy during events she later described as traumatic written records of conversations that directly opposed her public characterizations of our relationship. Most damaging to Emily's narrative were the journal entries documenting times when she'd specifically thanked me for my support during difficult periods, when she'd acknowledged her own mistakes and expressed gratitude for my patience and understanding. These authentic records, written in my own hand years before her viral campaign began, painted a picture of our relationship that was complex and human, rather than the simplified abuse narrative she'd created for public consumption. The platform's response was measured but significant. Facing potential legal scrutiny and armed with documentation that certain content was demonstrably false, they quietly removed some of Emily's most vicious and fabricated posts. There was no public announcement or explanation, just the subtle disappearance of content that violated their terms of service regarding harassment and misinformation. Emily's followers began noticing the missing posts and questioning what had happened to content they'd shared and discussed extensively. While no official explanation was provided, the platform's action created doubt about the reliability of Emily's narrative and the legitimacy of her claims. Her engagement numbers began dropping as some followers questioned whether they'd been manipulated into participating in a harassment campaign based on lies. Emily herself became visibly frustrated and agitated as she realized her platform was being subtly reined in by forces beyond her control. She couldn't publicly acknowledge that her content had been removed for violating platform policies without admitting that she'd been posting false information, but the missing posts created gaps in her narrative that sharp-eyed followers began to notice and question. Despite this quiet legal victory, I felt no triumph or satisfaction. The removal of some posts and the slight dip in Emily's engagement felt less like justice and more like bitter confirmation of what I'd already known, that my daughter was capable of systematic deception and had built her success on lies about the woman who'd raised her. Sitting in Jessica's office after receiving news of the platform's action, I felt utterly drained and hollow. The legal victory was meaningful in practical terms, establishing some boundaries around Emily's ability to spread the most blatant falsehoods about me, but it couldn't restore our relationship or heal the wounds that had been inflicted by months of public humiliation. This is progress, Jessica assured me, reviewing the documentation of Emily's reduced online reach and the platform's continued monitoring of her content. You've established legal precedent and created consequences for her actions. That's not nothing. But to me, it felt like attending the official funeral of any hope for reconciliation with my daughter. The formal legal proceedings marked the definitive end of our family relationship, replacing love and trust with court documents and platform violations. The air in the office felt heavy with the weight of shattered dreams and a stolen life, thick with the sadness that comes from realizing that some relationships can't be saved no matter how much love went into creating them. The platform's discreet action and the legal boundaries we'd established seemed to have a destabilizing effect on Emily that I hadn't anticipated. For months, she'd operated with complete impunity, secure in the knowledge that she could say anything about me without consequences. Now faced with evidence that there were limits to what even her most devoted followers would accept, she appeared to be recalculating her approach. 3 days after the platform removals, I received a message that made my heart stop. It appeared in my email inbox, with Emily's name in the sender field, the first direct communication I'd received from her since this nightmare began. My hands shook as I opened it, half expecting another public attack disguised as private correspondence. Instead, I found what appeared to be a genuine plea, carefully crafted to seem spontaneous and emotional, while maintaining enough ambiguity to protect her if the message became public. "Mom, please," it began. "I'm just so stressed with all the attention and pressure. Sometimes I miss our old life when it was just us. Remember when we used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings and watch old movies together? I miss you. Can't we find a way to fix this? I'm your only daughter, and you're my only mom." The message hit me like a physical blow, not because it offered hope, but because it revealed the sophisticated understanding Emily had of my psychological vulnerabilities. She knew exactly which memories would trigger my maternal instincts, which emotional buttons to push to create doubt about my resolve to maintain boundaries. Even her plea for reconciliation was manipulative, designed to serve her purposes rather than address the genuine harm she'd caused. I sat staring at the message for hours, feeling the familiar ache of grief for the daughter I'd once known, while recognizing the calculated nature of every word she'd chosen. This wasn't Emily reaching out from a place of genuine remorse or love. This was Emily, the influencer, crafting content designed to achieve a specific response from her target audience of one. Dr. Chen had prepared me for this possibility during our sessions, explaining how abusers often oscillate between cruelty and false affection as a way of maintaining control over their victims. When they sense they're losing power, she'd warned, they'll often return to the tactics that worked in the past, trying to reestablish the emotional bonds that allowed them to inflict harm in the first place. After a sleepless night of wrestling with my response, I finally sat down to write what I knew would be my final communication with Emily. Every word was carefully chosen, not for public consumption, but for the sake of my own psychological freedom. I needed to say goodbye to the daughter I'd loved, even knowing that she might use my words against me. "Emily," I wrote, "I read your message, and I understand that you're feeling pressure from the situation you've created. But the trust you shattered, the dignity you stole, the mother you publicly murdered for profit, these things can't be repaired with nostalgic memories and manipulative appeals to our biological connection." I continued with the kind of painful honesty that had always characterized my relationship with her, even when she was twisting that honesty into weapons. "There's nothing left to save between us. You chose to build your success on the foundation of my destruction, and that choice revealed something about your character that I can't unsee or forgive. This isn't anger speaking, this is acceptance of who you've chosen to become." The act of writing those words felt like performing surgery on my own heart, cutting away the last vestiges of hope that had sustained me through decades of unconditional love. But it also felt necessary, like finally acknowledging a death that had occurred months earlier when Emily first decided to sacrifice our relationship for internet fame. After sending the message, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, looking at a framed photograph of Emily as a small child that I'd kept on my nightstand throughout this ordeal. In the picture, she was maybe 5 years old, her arms wrapped around my neck as we both smiled at the camera with genuine joy and affection. That little girl seemed like a completely different person from the woman who had systematically destroyed my life for profit. A profound sadness washed over me as I allowed myself to imagine, for one last time, what our life could have been if Emily had chosen a different path. I pictured her using her communication skills and platform for genuinely positive purposes, building a career that didn't require the destruction of others. I imagined us growing old together with mutual respect and affection, sharing grandchildren and holidays, and the quiet comfort that comes from lifelong love. But that future had never been real. It had been a fantasy built on my misunderstanding of who Emily really was beneath the surface. The loving daughter I'd raised had either never existed or had been completely consumed by the influencer who'd taken her place. Either way, she was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring her back. I performed one final symbolic act of severance that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I deactivated my remaining social media accounts, cutting myself off from the digital world that had been the source of so much pain. I changed my phone number and email address, ensuring that Emily would have no way to contact me directly if she decided to escalate her manipulation tactics. Most difficult of all, I packed away all the photographs and mementos of Emily's childhood, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. The reminders of who she'd once been, or who I'd believed her to be, were too painful to encounter in my daily life. I stored them carefully in boxes that I placed in the back of my closet, understanding that I might never be strong enough to look at them again. The act felt like conducting a funeral for the family I'd thought we were acknowledging the death of relationships that had once been the center of my existence. I was cutting the last threads of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable, accepting that some forms of love can be weaponized by people willing to sacrifice anything for personal gain. As I sat in my stripped-down apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life rebuilt from nothing, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. The pain of losing Emily was profound and would probably never fully heal. But the constant fear of her next attack, the vigilance required to monitor her campaigns against me, the hope that had kept me vulnerable to her manipulation, all of that was finally over. The shift in public perception began not with a dramatic revelation or sudden awakening, but with the slow, steady erosion of Emily's carefully constructed narrative. The platform's quiet removal of her most egregious content had created subtle gaps in her story that observant followers began to notice and question. Screenshots of missing posts circulated in private forums with people wondering why certain evidence of my supposed abuse had mysteriously disappeared. Independent bloggers and citizen journalists, drawn by the inconsistencies they were detecting, began conducting their own investigations into Emily's claims. They noticed discrepancies in her timeline, identified manipulated audio clips, and discovered instances where her descriptions of events didn't align with publicly available information about our family's history. These findings circulated in smaller online communities, creating pockets of skepticism that gradually expanded. A particularly damaging analysis appeared on a media literacy blog that specialized in examining viral content for signs of manipulation. The author, a digital forensics expert, had analyzed Emily's videos frame by frame and identified numerous instances of audio editing, selective cropping of photographs, and other techniques designed to distort reality. The post was titled, "The Anatomy of a Viral Lie: How Digital Manipulation Creates False Narratives." And while it didn't mention Emily by name, anyone familiar with her content could easily recognize the examples being dissected. The blog post gained traction among media professionals and educators who were concerned about the spread of misinformation on social platforms. It was shared in journalism schools and digital literacy workshops as an example of how sophisticated manipulation techniques could fool even educated audiences. The academic attention brought a level of scrutiny to Emily's content that it had never faced before. Emily's comment sections, once filled with uncritical adulation and supportive messages, began showing signs of growing skepticism. Questions that would have been immediately shouted down by her devoted followers were now gaining traction and generating thoughtful discussions. People were asking for specific details about her claims, requesting evidence for her most serious accusations, and pointing out contradictions between her various statements. The brands that had rushed to sponsor Emily during her initial surge of popularity were now conducting more thorough background checks before renewing contracts. Corporate lawyers were advising caution about associating with influencers whose content might be built on unverifiable or potentially false claims. Several major sponsorship deals were quietly allowed to expire without renewal, cutting into Emily's primary source of income. Her engagement metrics told the story of her declining influence more clearly than any public criticism. Where her posts had once generated hundreds of thousands of likes and shares within hours, they now struggled to maintain the algorithm's attention. Her follower count, while still substantial, had plateaued and was showing the first signs of decline as people became less interested in her increasingly repetitive content. But perhaps most damaging to Emily's credibility was the growing number of former followers who were privately reaching out to express their doubts about her narrative. These weren't trolls or obvious antagonists, but thoughtful people who had initially believed her story, but were now questioning whether they'd been manipulated into participating in a harassment campaign based on false information. One such message came from a young woman named Sarah, who had been one of Emily's most vocal supporters during the early days of her campaign against me. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," she wrote in a carefully worded email, "and I realize I never questioned what I was being told. I'm sorry for any part I played in spreading information that might not have been true." These private apologies were both healing and heartbreaking. Each one represented a person who'd been used as a weapon against me, but had eventually recognized their manipulation. Their messages offered validation that I hadn't imagined the cruelty I'd experienced, but they also served as reminders of how many people had been turned against me during my darkest period. I accepted these gestures of reconciliation with quiet gratitude, understanding that the people reaching out had also been victims of Emily's manipulation, albeit in a different way. They'd been used to amplify her message and enforce her narrative, often without fully understanding the human cost of their participation in the digital mob she'd assembled. Throughout this gradual shift in public perception, I maintained the same quiet dignity that had sustained me through the worst of Emily's attacks. I didn't engage with the emerging discussions about her credibility, didn't provide additional evidence to fuel the growing skepticism, and didn't attempt to capitalize on her declining influence. The truth was speaking for itself, and I had no desire to become another public figure built on controversy and conflict. But despite the subtle vindication and the growing recognition that I'd been unjustly targeted, a profound sense of isolation continued to define my daily existence. The damage to my ability to trust others and form deep connections had been done during those months of systematic attack, and it couldn't be undone by the mere recognition that I'd been wronged. Every new person I met carried the potential to recognize me from Emily's campaign, to harbor preconceived notions about my character based on information they'd consumed during her viral moment. Even when people approached me with kindness and apparent acceptance, I found myself constantly analyzing their motives and questioning whether their friendship was genuine or motivated by curiosity about the woman who'd been so publicly destroyed by her own daughter. The scars left by Emily's betrayal ran deeper than public reputation or social standing. They'd fundamentally altered my understanding of human nature and family bonds, teaching me lessons about manipulation and cruelty that I'd never wanted to learn. The innocence that had allowed me to love unconditionally and trust completely had been permanently destroyed, replaced by a wariness that colored even the most innocent interactions. My truth was now understood by a growing number of people, and my character had been largely restored in the court of public opinion. But my heart remained marked by the knowledge that the person I'd loved most in the world had been willing to sacrifice me completely for personal gain, and no amount of external validation could heal that particular wound. With the digital storm finally beginning to subside and Emily's influence waning, I found myself facing a challenge I hadn't anticipated: learning how to exist in a world where I was no longer under constant attack, but also no longer had any clear sense of purpose or identity. The woman I'd been before Emily's campaign, someone defined largely by my role as her mother, no longer existed, and I had to discover who I might become in the aftermath of such complete destruction. The process of rebuilding began with the smallest possible steps. I started taking daily walks through neighborhoods where I was less likely to be recognized, rediscovering the simple pleasure of moving through the world without fear of confrontation or public humiliation. These walks became a form of meditation, allowing me to reconnect with my physical surroundings and begin the slow process of reclaiming my right to exist in public spaces. Dr. Chen had suggested that I explore activities that might help me develop new sources of identity and purpose beyond my former role as Emily's mother. Following her advice, I began volunteering at the local animal shelter, finding comfort in caring for creatures who offered unconditional affection without judgment or agenda. The dogs and cats didn't care about my viral infamy or the complexities of my relationship with Emily. They simply appreciated attention, gentle handling, and consistent care. Working with abandoned and abused animals proved unexpectedly therapeutic. Their capacity for trust despite past trauma inspired me, and their ability to form new bonds after experiencing betrayal offered hope for my own future. I found particular purpose in working with the older animals that potential adopters often overlooked, understanding intimately the pain of being discarded and forgotten. I also joined a small book club that met weekly at the local library, drawn by the promise of intellectual engagement and social connection that wasn't based on personal history or digital personas. The group was composed mostly of retired people who valued thoughtful discussion and respected each other's privacy. For the first time in months, I was able to have conversations about ideas and stories rather than defending my character or explaining my situation. These new routines created a framework for rebuilding my life, but they couldn't erase the profound impact of Emily's betrayal on my fundamental understanding of human relationships. The memories of her campaign against me were always present, surfacing unexpectedly during quiet moments and coloring even positive interactions with shadows of doubt and wariness. Evenings were particularly difficult when the day's activities gave way to solitude and reflection. I would find myself looking through old photographs of Emily as a child, trying to reconcile the innocent face smiling back at me with the person who had systematically destroyed my life for profit. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the same person who had once climbed into my bed during thunderstorms have grown into someone capable of such calculated cruelty? Sometimes I would sit with one of her baby pictures, tears blurring the image as I mourned not just the relationship we'd lost, but the future we would never have together. There would be no shared holidays, no grandchildren to spoil, no comfortable conversations about growing older. Emily had chosen to trade all of that for viral fame and sponsorship deals, leaving me to grieve for a family that existed now only in photographs and increasingly painful memories. But alongside the persistent sorrow, small moments of genuine joy began to emerge with increasing frequency. The purr of a rescue cat settling into my lap during my volunteer shifts. The laughter shared with my book club when we discovered we'd all misunderstood the same plot twist. The quiet satisfaction of watching a sunrise paint the sky in brilliant colors during my morning walks. These moments of contentment felt particularly precious because they'd been hard-won, earned through the process of rebuilding, rather than simply inherited from more innocent times. They represented proof that meaning and beauty could still be found even after experiencing the worst kind of betrayal, that joy was still possible even when filtered through the knowledge of human capacity for cruelty. I began painting again, something I hadn't done since Emily's childhood, when my artistic pursuits had taken a back seat to the demands of single parenthood. Working with watercolors allowed me to express emotions that words couldn't capture, creating abstract representations of my internal landscape that somehow felt more honest than any verbal description of my experience. The paintings were dark, initially filled with jagged lines and muddy colors that reflected my emotional state during the worst of Emily's campaign. But gradually, lighter elements began appearing, small patches of blue sky, visible through storm clouds, delicate flowers growing from rocky soil, suggestions of hope and renewal emerging from devastation. Occasionally, I would hear updates about Emily through the inevitable gossip networks of a small community. Her online platform continued its slow decline as the novelty of her story wore off and audiences moved on to newer, more sensational content. The brands that had once competed for her endorsement were now focusing their attention on influencers with more stable and growing followings. Her financial situation appeared to be deteriorating as the income from her viral moment dried up and she struggled to maintain relevance in an increasingly competitive digital landscape. The brief burst of fame that had seemed so valuable when she was destroying my life was proving to be unsustainable without continuous escalation and fresh controversy to feed the algorithm's appetite. These reports of Emily's declining fortunes didn't bring me satisfaction or vindication. Instead, they felt like confirmation of what I'd always known, that building success on the destruction of others was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. She'd traded our relationship and my reputation for something that was proving to be temporary and ultimately worthless, leaving both of us poorer for the exchange. The justice I was witnessing wasn't the result of my actions or intervention. It was simply the natural consequence of Emily's choices playing out over time. The digital world that had elevated her so quickly was equally quick to forget her, moving on to new stories and fresh trauma to consume and commodify. As I settled into my new routines and began to feel more stable in my rebuilt life, I realized that my goal was no longer to recover what I'd lost or to return to who I'd been before. Instead, I was learning to become someone entirely new, someone shaped by suffering, but not defined by it, someone who could carry scars without being destroyed by them. On a particularly quiet evening, 6 months after severing all contact with Emily, I found myself drawn to the box where I'd stored my old journals. I'd avoided opening it since packing away those painful reminders, but something about the peaceful stillness of my apartment that night made the prospect feel manageable rather than devastating. I pulled out one of the older journals, its pages yellowed with age and filled with my careful handwriting, documenting the small moments and major milestones of Emily's childhood. Opening it to a random page, I found an entry from when she was 7 years old, describing a conversation we'd had about her fears of starting second grade. Emily was so worried about having a new teacher, I'd written, but after I reassured her that it was normal to feel nervous about changes, she climbed into my lap and said, "Mommy, I'm glad I can tell you anything, and you'll still love me." I told her, "That's what mothers are for, to love you no matter what." She fell asleep in my arms while I read to her, and I felt so grateful to be her mom. Reading those words felt like viewing artifacts from a lost civilization, evidence of a relationship built on mutual love and trust that seemed impossible to reconcile with the calculated cruelty Emily had later displayed. The child who had once sought comfort in my arms had grown into a woman who'd weaponized our most intimate moments for public consumption. But this time, instead of fighting the wave of grief that washed over me, I simply allowed it to exist. I sat with the journal in my lap, letting the tears come without trying to stop them or analyze them or transform them into something more productive. For the first time since this nightmare began, I gave myself permission to mourn fully and completely for what we'd lost. The sorrow I felt wasn't just about Emily's betrayal. It was about the complete severing of the maternal bond that had defined my identity for over 3 decades. It was grief for the innocence I'd lost, the trust that had been shattered, the future we would never share. These wounds had become part of me, woven into the fabric of my being so thoroughly that healing them would require healing the fundamental structure of who I was. As I sat there in the gentle lamplight, holding physical evidence of the love that had once existed between us, I began to understand that my goal shouldn't be to eliminate this pain or pretend it didn't matter. These scars were proof that I'd loved deeply and completely, evidence of the mother I'd been, even if Emily had chosen to forget or distort that history. The realization brought with it a profound shift in my understanding of what healing actually meant. I'd been approaching my recovery with the expectation that success would look like returning to my previous emotional state, regaining the capacity for unconditional trust and unlimited vulnerability that had characterized my relationship with Emily. But sitting with my grief in that quiet moment, I recognized that true healing might mean something entirely different. True healing meant learning to carry this pain with grace and dignity, to acknowledge the scars without allowing them to consume my entire existence. It meant understanding that I could still find meaning and joy and connection in my life, even while carrying the permanent ache of maternal loss. It meant accepting that some wounds don't heal in the traditional sense, they simply become integrated into who we are. This acceptance brought with it a deeper level of peace than I'd experienced since Emily's first attack. The constant internal struggle to overcome my pain, to move past the betrayal, to somehow return to a state of innocence I'd never regain, all of that exhausting effort could finally be released. Instead of fighting against my reality, I could begin working with it, building a life that honored both my suffering and my strength. I closed the journal carefully and returned it to its box. But this time, the action felt less like burial and more like preservation. These memories weren't enemies to be defeated. They were witnesses to a love that had been real, even if it hadn't been returned in the way I'd believed. Emily's ability to exploit our relationship didn't diminish the authenticity of what I'd felt and given. Standing in my small apartment, surrounded by the simple life I'd built, from the ashes of public humiliation and family destruction, I felt a quiet strength that was different from anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't the naive optimism of someone who hadn't yet encountered real cruelty, nor was it the brittle defiance of someone still actively fighting against their circumstances. Instead, it was the steady resilience of someone who had seen the worst that human nature could offer and had chosen to continue existing with integrity and grace. I'd learned that love could be weaponized, that trust could be exploited, that even the closest family bonds could be sacrificed for personal gain. But I'd also learned that these devastating truths didn't have to destroy my capacity for meaning, connection, and even joy. My future stretched ahead of me, not as a restoration of what had been lost, but as something entirely new, a tapestry woven with threads of both sorrow and contentment, wisdom earned through suffering and beauty discovered in unexpected places. I would continue my volunteer work with abandoned animals, my connections with the book club, my artistic explorations, and quiet walks through the world. There would be difficult moments ahead, anniversaries that brought sharp pangs of loss, unexpected reminders of the family that no longer existed, instances when the weight of solitude felt almost unbearable. But there would also be continued growth, new friendships, small adventures, and the ongoing satisfaction of a life lived authentically rather than for public approval. Most importantly, I would carry forward the knowledge that my worth hadn't been determined by Emily's betrayal, that my capacity for love hadn't been diminished by her inability to return it honestly. The woman who had been systematically destroyed by her own daughter for profit had emerged with her essential self intact, scarred but unbroken, alone, but not without value, changed but not defeated. I walked to my bedroom window and looked out at the quiet street below, where other people were living their own complex lives, filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and disappointment, love and loss. I was part of that human tapestry now, in a way I'd never been before, not as someone untouched by real suffering, but as someone who had survived the worst and chosen to keep going anyway. The peace I felt wasn't the absence of pain, but the integration of pain into a life that remained worth living. And somehow, in that quiet acceptance of my transformed reality, I found a strength that no amount of viral hatred or family betrayal could ever take away from me. My new life, though fundamentally different from anything I'd once envisioned, has found its own rhythm of quiet fulfillment. It's not the public vindication or familial warmth I once dreamed of sharing with Emily, but rather something carved from the raw materials of immense betrayal and profound public humiliation. I've discovered a deep self-sufficiency. I never knew I possessed a wisdom gleaned from exploring the darkest corners of human nature and an appreciation for the genuine connections that can be forged through shared understanding of life's harshest lessons. I am stronger now, wiser, and undeniably changed by what I've endured. The scars of my daughter's digital betrayal remain visible in the way I approach new relationships with careful boundaries, in the moments when grief still catches me unexpectedly, in my permanent understanding that even the closest bonds can be weaponized by those willing to sacrifice love for personal gain. These marks have shaped me profoundly, but they no longer define the entirety of my existence. The woman who sits in this modest apartment, tending to rescued animals and finding purpose in helping others navigate their own difficulties, bears little resemblance to the mother who once believed unconditionally in the permanence of family love. That woman's innocence was destroyed completely, but something more durable has taken its place, a quiet resilience that comes from having survived the worst and chosen to continue living with grace and integrity. Life has taught me that even the purest maternal love can be met with calculated exploitation, and that some wounds, especially those inflicted by one's own child, never truly heal in the traditional sense. The ache of losing not just Emily, but the illusion of who I thought she was, will always remain with me. Yet I've learned that true peace isn't found in the absence of pain or in dreams of revenge, but in accepting what is while refusing to let betrayal poison what still could be. It's about finding the quiet strength to carry your sorrows with dignity while remaining open to whatever small joys and meaningful connections might still emerge. It's about discovering that integrity, the alignment between who you are and how you live, cannot be stolen by others, only surrendered by yourself. Some wounds never truly heal, but they remind us of the battles we've survived and the depth of our capacity to endure. And sometimes that quiet strength, that enduring echo of a mother's authentic love, is more than enough to build a life worth living.